ברכות לחברי גל כלב על הוצאת הספר החשוב הזה. ספר שעוסק בהיסטוריה שעוברת היהדות, ששמה את הציונות כעוגן המרכזי שלה. לגל הבנה עמוקה על הרצל ועל התהליכים הקורים בעולם היהודי והלא יהודי. הוא שם את שני אלה ביחד ומתאר בספרו איך גם היהודים וגם הלא יהודים מתייחסים כיום יותר ויותר ליהדות דרך הציונות. בדיוק כפי שהרצל תיאר בחזונו. אני מברך את הפעילות האדירה סביב הספר ואת אירועי ההשקה ואת הפעילויות בקבוצות המחקר, ואני שמח שספר זה זכה לתמיכה בקרב הקהל הרחב, מכל הקשת הפוליטית העולמית, שמאלנים, ימנים, יהודים, נוצרים, מוסלמים, דתיים, חילונים, ובמיוחד שאנשים מכל מיני גילאים באים לאירועים ומקיימים דיונים סביב הספר, סביב הציונות, סביב היהדות. חגיגה ציונית אמיתית. ברכות על הספר וישר כוח גדול.
Good evening. Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Paul Gross, for such a great introduction. And thank you for joining what is sure to be a compelling and inspiring evening. And of course, thank you to Yaakov Hagoel for highlighting why Judaism 3.0 has sparked so many interesting conversations since the book was launched only a few months ago. And of course, if you want to hear more about the book, please be sure to visit the website, which is Judaism-Zionism.com. So I first met Gol a few years ago on a night very much like this one, those warm summer nights of Jerusalem that can be quite sweltering, but suddenly shifts into this season that doesn't quite feel like fall and doesn't quite feel like spring, but it's something magical in between that I've only experienced in this beautiful city. When we met, like tonight, there was of course wine, but also a discussion of Zionism, Israel, and what it means to have your feet planted firmly in both Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. As someone who knows the back and forth between those two cities all too well, I was born in Jerusalem and lived most of my life in the United States, then came back to Tel Aviv, and then moved to Jerusalem, where I lived for a number of years, only to find myself back in the suburbs of Tel Aviv once again. And Gol and I connected very much on that level. And over the years, he fleshed out those ideas about the journey between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. And years later, he's fleshed out all these ideas and his ideas on Zionism into one fabulous book. So over the years, we've touched on those many points that he articulated in the book. And in both professional and personal contexts, we've discussed over glasses of wine and in his articles that I edited professionally while working at the Jerusalem Post. He talked about the trends of the 2016 election and how it affects American Jewry and anti-Semitism in Europe, and of course, the evolution of religiosity in Israel. But what struck me most about his book and his concept of what binds all of us Jews together, for better or worse, is Zionism. If you love Israel, well, of course you're a Zionist. If you hate Israel, whether you're a Jew or non-Jew, well, then Zionism actually, or your perception of it, drives one's hatred for the Jewish state. In an ever-fragmented world, I suppose it's reassuring that there is one singular thing that manages to keep us together, but also sadly drive us apart. So tonight we have an incredibly dynamic and formidable array of speakers. Paul went into more detail about them, but I will just remind you. We have here, of course, Gol, who's a published author of his very first book and also an accomplished journalist and speaker. We have Daniel Gordis, who is an icon of Jewish thought, a historian and writer who's able to crystallize thousands of years of Jewish history and who makes it seem fresh and relevant in today's eyes, which is no small feat. And Moshe Koppel, your book, Judaism Straight Up, touches on some similar themes as Judaism 3.0 and looks at the trends transforming contemporary Jewish society. And even Haaretz boasted that your think tank is shaping right-wing thought, so it must be true. So I'm looking forward to hearing your perspective tonight as well. Each of you will have 7 to 10 minutes for your opening remarks, and then I will ask a question of my own as my prerogative as moderator, and then we would love to hear questions from the audience as well. I remind you that there are questions, not keep them concise. Gol, since your book is a centerpiece of our conversation tonight, it's fitting that you start us off. Thank you.
Oh, hello. Thank you, Noa. And thank you, everybody, for coming here. As Paul said, it's great to see people in live and not just on Zoom. Thank you to the Begin Center and specifically to Paul for organizing this and having us back here to talk about issues relating to Judaism 3.0. And I'm honored and humbled to be in the company of two great thinkers, Daniel Gordis and Moshe Koppel, who I look forward to having a dynamic conversation. Thanks, Noa, again for your rewards. And thank you very much, Kohelet, who is really is Herzl's successor. Theodore Herzl founded the World Zionist Organization and had a few people after him. And now Kohelet is holding that baton. So it means a lot to get such a warm endorsement to the book and to the ideas and such greetings. So I'm, the topic is from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, Zionism's religious revival, but I'd like to maybe take a couple of minutes to just place it in the context of the general thesis of the book. In a nutshell, I am arguing that, as Noa said and as Paul said, that Judaism is going through a historic transformation and that Zionism is becoming its anchor, its organizing principle. And that is a very similar transformation that occurred 2,000 years ago. At the beginning, at the onset, Judaism was centered here in Judea, in Zion, in Jerusalem, and was anchored in the temple and in the ritual of the sacrifices. That was the anchor, the organizing principle of Judaism 1.0. Once the Romans expelled the Jews and destroyed the temples, the ritual of the sacrifices ceased, and all of those connection points were gone. Judaism had to transform in order to survive, and it did. So Judaism 2.0 is basically the exile years, anchored in the internal glue of religiosity, what people call Rabbinic Judaism, which is the religious Judaism that we know today, and an external glue in a sense of complete insularity. Jews had no way to get out. So that's how Judaism more or less survived for those 2,000 years. The Jewish nation religion had a religious glue inside and the insular glue outside. Both of those are gone. If 100 or 200 years ago, nearly all Jews were religiously observant and there was a sufficiently strong enough glue to hold them in. Today, researchers estimate 10 to 20% of the Jews are religiously observant. We get a nice panel here of two people who are not at least seemingly religious and two people who are seemingly are. But around the world, it's only about 10 or 20% of the Jews are religious. But on the other hand, the national aspect of the Jewish nation religion has been dramatically augmented with the establishment of the State of Israel. And what I'm showing in the book is that how both Jews and non-Jews, religious, non-religious, increasingly relate to Judaism through the prism of Zionism. That the national aspect of the Jewish nation religion has become its anchor, and that actually strengthened the religious aspect as well. The fact that people connect to Judaism through its national aspect doesn't mean that they're not, they can be religious, they can be secular, but that is the most relevant aspect of Judaism. So it's in a sense a simple story. We're here, at Judaism 1.0, we left and we developed something else, Judaism 2.0, and now that we're back, the majority of Jews are now back in Israel. Then Judaism is transformed and we're in Judaism 3.0 and Zionism is its anchor. But that did not happen upon the establishment of the State of Israel, nor in Israel 70 years. Because transformation of such magnitude take a long time to happen. The original transformation from Judaism 1.0 to 2.0 didn't happen, the year or the decade that the Jews were expelled from Judea, after the temple was destroyed. It took centuries. But also that there were insurmountable hurdles that have prevented from this transformation from Zionism to becoming the anchor of Judaism. And one of those hurdles is the one we're going to be speaking about tonight, which is that Zionism until now has long been perceived
Recording in progress.
as a secular ideal, maybe overly associated with secularism and even the rejection of religion. And if you're over associated with secularism and sort of reject religion, you cannot be the organizing principle of a nation religion. What I'm arguing in the book and what we'll discuss today is that has changed. That is no longer the case today, that there's a shift. Now, Zionism was, the idea of Zionism was conceived by Theodore Herzl. He convened the first Zionist Congress in 1897, and in fact, the World Zionist Organization led by Kohelet that we just heard from is marking this, the 125-year anniversary of that, with sort of a reenactment and discussions around it back in Basel. So in Basel in 1897, Herzl convened the Jews after basically almost 2,000 years that they did not have a united political leadership. He identified that problem. He thought that the primary problem of Judaism of 2,000 years is not the prosecutions, which were brutal, but the lack of united political leadership, which was worse. And that's what he set to do when he established the Zionist Congress. And when he did that, he made very, very clear to the delegates and to the world that Zionism will not do anything that will hurt any aspect of the religiosity of Judaism. None of the religious aspect of Judaism will be compromised or hurt by Zionism. He did not intend for Zionism to be an entity that will reject religion. He intended for Zionism to be an ideal, an infinite ideal that will include the Jewish religiosity in it. And Herzl wrote a lot about it, a lot in his diary, a lot through letters that he went back and forth, and we have with colleagues, and certainly in the speeches he gave in the Zionist Congress, including the first Zionist Congress. But over the years, as Zionism have moved from being in the minds of one person, of Theodore Herzl, into a movement of mass proportion, which eventually served as the infrastructure for the creation of the Jewish state, then that idea relative, or that views relative to this religion and secularism has evolved. The old joke that when you get 3 Jews in a room, you have at least 5 or 6 opinions was very valid even in the first Zionist Congress, but certainly after Herzl's demise. And there were various parties, and the party that took control and won the elections to the Zionist institutions in the 1930s was a party led by Ben-Gurion, which is a revolutionary theme, that they were sort of rejecting the old Jew and creating a new Jew. There was a socialist party. So Israel in its early year and Zionism in those crucial decades were shaped in that Rome. This is a group, what later became the Labor Party, that held power in Zionism and then in the State of Israel from the mid-1930s until 1977. And I think it's fair to say that they've ruled in a way that was that they consolidated power, a little bit of letat senu, the state is ours. To get certain jobs, you need to bring a note from the party. If you are from the wrong party, you didn't get the good real estate in Tel Aviv. From Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, there's in northern Tel Aviv, a neighborhood which now is prime real estate, but back then was in the farther northern suburbs. It's called Shikun HaEtzel, Ran Even Gvirol, and the Yarkon River. So Zionism going into from the 1930s into the 21st century was shaped in that Rome. And this is in spite of the fact that the majority of people here in the land of Israel, for the most part, were religious. They were religious during what we call the Old Yishuv, before the immigration of the late 19th century. They were religious during the first immigration of the late 19th century, early 20th century. Only for a few decades, in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, Israel had a secular majority. And since the 1950s, since the migration of what we call the Great Migration, that included a lot of Jews from the Middle East that were religious, later to be known as traditional. Once that happened, Israel over time resumed the majority, its religious/traditional majority, which it has today. Today, the majority of Israelis self-identify themselves as either Haredi, national religious or traditional, and the minority self-identifies them as secular. And I think this is one of the, with that, when you have that hurdle, Zionism cannot be the anchor or the organizing principle of Judaism. But I think we're saying two parallel processes right now in Israel. One is a democratization, if you will, of power in Israel, a shift of Zionist ethos and power from the secular minority to the religious/traditional majority, not just in terms of voting, but also in terms of leadership, in terms of military roles, military commanders, people who volunteer, people who serve in elite units. We said in Israel, we like to say, Kol Ha'am Tzava. We are a nation that we're all soldiers, we're all in the army. That army is now, many of them are led by religious people. Amos Oz, Noah, like you, somebody who was born in Jerusalem, but then later made his way away from Jerusalem, not just geographically, but also in rhetoric. He used to say that the religious people are akin to the kosher inspector in the cafeteria car of the Zionist train. So there were, the nice, people that, maybe he was thinking of politicians like Yosef Burg, who led the National Religious Party and was a gentleman, and he was, Minister of Interior, or Minister of the Post Office, not somebody that aspired to be the Prime Minister of Israel. Well, things have changed, and the national religious people today are leading, as I said, in all fronts, including in academia, including certainly in medicine, in high tech, in a lot of things, and in the army. They're no longer in the cafeteria car of the Zionist train. I think they're very much in the locomotive car of the Zionist train. And that relates to the second process that's happening, which is sort of a religious fashion within the seculars in Israel. Secular Israelis that in the past were nervous of being perceived, of being chozer b'tshuva, becoming religious because it was not cool, it was unfashionable, it was inconsistent with the Zionist narrative. Now we're seeing more and more secular Israelis consuming religious experience a la carte while staying secular. Maybe it's kiddush, maybe it's a little bit of learning, maybe it's going to synagogue. They're staying secular, but they're not anti-religious anymore. And this has to do, I think, also with what I mentioned about the military commanders. We admire our military commanders, our cultural icons. If you're a secular person that you used to admire your military commander that was from a kibbutz and was eating pork and was anti-religious, now we admire those military commanders who wear a kippah and maybe live in a settlement, maybe live in Jerusalem. So that contributes to the shift. Our cultural icons also have changed. Shlomo Aziz, one of the sort of icons of Israeli secularism, of Zionism really, that we all grew up on his songs in the 1970s and 80s and 90s all the way till today, probably the most well-known Israeli singer. If in the 70s he would sing about songs, God did not command us anything, or that weren't particularly religious. Now, over the last few years, he has a duet with Ishai Ribo, who is one of the most known religious singer, with lyrics like, the truth is that you are our God and you are our saviors, and there's no more. Secular Israelis, we have Aviv Geffen, who is also, maybe one of the most known people affiliated with the far left of Israelis, doing a duet with Avraham Fried, who is a Haredi singer. So there is secular Zionism, even the secular aspect, seculars of Zionism are no longer, I would say, as secular as they used to be. And therefore, there is a religious revival in Zionism that we feel it, and it relates to the Tel Aviv versus Jerusalem thing. I don't think it's a competition between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. I think we're very lucky to have two for the price of one. I'm from Tel Aviv. I'm a third-generation Tel Avivi, and now live in Jerusalem. Recently moved to Jerusalem, but I don't. I love Tel Aviv, my hometown, and I go there very often because now we have a train that is 35 minutes away. If Amos Oz, the same Israeli author that talked about the cafeteria car in the Zionist train, he also defined the relationship between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem as a battle. And he says that he, in this battle, is choosing Tel Aviv because he's choosing sanity and contemporaneous and not the past. This is not a battle anymore. You can have both. Shannon Street, one of the sort of like this Jay-Z of Israel, perhaps. The Hadag Nachash has a famous song, Ine Ani Ba, here I come, Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, Jerusalem. He cannot decide if he wants to be Tel Aviv in Jerusalem. Now you don't need to decide. There's a train, and it works very nicely. And that enables people from outside of Israel, from Tel Aviv, to see Jerusalem and to no longer be afraid of Jerusalem. Because let's face it, over the last 2,000 years, what is the image of Jerusalem? It is, Tisha B'Av, it is destruction, it is, I will not forget you, Jerusalem. One day I'll come back to Jerusalem. And it's very, we remember Jerusalem from the sadness. And in the Israeli ethos, we think Jerusalem is far. You got to go, up the hill and, stop your car along the way because it gets heated up. And we, remember Jerusalem under siege and Bab el-Wad and all those things that have shaped our views of Jerusalem. That's no longer Jerusalem. If in the past people said Tel Aviv is for playing and Jerusalem is for praying, now you have a lot of prayers in Tel Aviv, and you definitely have a lot of play in Jerusalem, but it is done in a Jerusalem context. During the Corona wave, we've seen a lot of people from Tel Aviv come to Jerusalem because they couldn't go abroad, come to the Shuk and saw the beauty of Jerusalem, and maybe that contributed to the shift that, when you go to the Shuk Machne Yehuda, that people on Zoom and on social media are strongly encouraged to come to Israel and visit it. It's not just a market, it's cafes and bars, and you quite literally sit in a bar next to a nun, next to an Orthodox Jew, next to a Palestinian, next to a European diplomat. It's not a line from a joke, it's a reality in Jerusalem. And that's why I think Jerusalem has sort of replaced Tel Aviv in a sense. Well, Tel Aviv is great, but is in a sense, Jerusalem is the ultimate be who you are city, with a lot of pluralism and a lot of intellectual conversation that gets sparked up randomly, like the conversation I had with Noah a few years ago, and that we're going to have now. That's not random, but that's Jerusalem. But I would end with just saying two things. One is that this whole Tel Aviv, Jerusalem thing, it's great to be at the Begin Center and celebrate Begin, who's now a consensus figure in Israel, which just shows how, images can change over time. Begin, in the 1970s was not a consensus figure in Israel. But Begin also have moved a few times from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. When I lived in Tel Aviv, I was next to a synagogue that has a sign that in this synagogue prayed a rabbi, Israel Sassoff, if I remember correctly. That was Begin. That was his code name when he was hiding for the British. And then when I moved to Jerusalem, one of the first months that I was here, an old man, I was helping an old man with his bags from the groceries. And when I walked to his home, there was a sign, Begin lived here. And he was very proud to show me the ground floor where Begin used to live. So Begin himself moved a few times from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. This thing of Jews coming back to Jerusalem is new. It's only happened, officially in 1948 and then officially more in 1967. We're still in the early stages of understanding what it means. Of Jerusalem Day is still about the flag parade and not about this epic thing that have happened. Because if you think about it, we are completing now one of humanity's greatest cycles. Over 2,000 years ago, both Jews and Judaism were deported out of Jerusalem. And for 2,000 years, both Jews and Judaism were away. The Jews, as I mentioned, have come back. And what I'm arguing in the book is that now Judaism is coming back. And Jerusalem and Zion is becoming the central focal point of Judaism. And that is exactly what Herzl envisioned in that first Zionist Congress that we're going to mark 125 years. He said that Zionism is the return to Judaism, even before it is the return to the land of the Jews. And I think we're seeing that very clearly today. Zionism is increasingly the conduit that people relate to Judaism through in positive and negative alike, mostly a lot of negative. And Zionism has become the most relevant aspect of Judaism, the aspect of Judaism that evokes passions, engagement. Zionism has become the anchor of Judaism. Thank you.
Hi, good evening. I want to begin by thanking the Begin Center and Paul for the generous invitation to be here tonight, and of course to wish Gal Mazal Tov on the appearance of the book. It's an extraordinary accomplishment, and I agree with what Noah said. I think In many ways, the importance of the book is that it is really sparking a lot of conversation. And sparking conversation in the Jewish world, sparking conversation in the contemporary world, frankly, is not easy to do. It's easy to spark argument. It's not easy to spark conversation. And I really think that the book is sparking conversation because the premise is so interesting, so fascinating, and we're all in your debt for really, I think, raising very important questions about Judaism in the modern world, Israel in the place of Jewish life, and so forth. So I want to begin by proving Gol's point, which is to say that Zionism has become the anchor of Judaism these days. And the way to prove that point is to basically remind yourself of what, outside of Israel probably, what most Jewish conversations look like, especially in the United States. But if you were to say most of the people that you know, United States, England, France, Australia, South Africa, wherever, say to them, have a Jewish conversation now for the next hour, but don't mention Israel. They would actually, in most cases, not be able to do it. They would actually not be able to do it largely because, as Gol points out, Zionism really has become such an important organizing principle of contemporary Jewish life. But they also would be able to do it because, in a certain way, Zionism has filled a void that has been left by a complete lack of Jewish literacy in almost every other way. In other words, yes, Zionism isn't a pretty important thing. I think those of us who live here who made Aliyah didn't make Aliyah by accident. We didn't think we were going somewhere else and then got on the wrong plane. We came here on purpose. But I think it's also important to say that one of the reasons that Zionism has become such an important grounding principle in Jewish life is because it's really very hard to have, in many circles, substantive Jewish conversations about anything else sans Israel. And that's a mark of tremendous worry, which I'll come back to in a second, because I don't think Zionism can survive that entirely either. So the first point that I wanted to make is that I think Gol's quite correct. Zionism really has become the organizing principle. Now, of course, this wouldn't be a Jewish evening if I just stopped there and said about all the ways in which I agree with the book. I want to try to just take, not exception, but take issue or press on a couple of different points, only because that's the way that we get conversations going. So I want to say something about 3.0, first of all, and then I want to say something about the return or the rise of religiosity within the Zionist world, and then I'll stop and then we'll continue it in the Q&A section. 3.0 is very much in vogue these days in the Zionist world. I don't know if it's because, iOS are up to 15.8, I think, or something like that. But Zionism 15.8 isn't nearly as catchy as Zionism 3.0. But there's a problem. There's Judaism 3.0, there's Zionism 3.0 that's being discussed out in the Bay Area in one of the JCCs. The Ashman JCC in the Bay Area is doing a whole project. It's become a national project, Zionism 3.0. We're now talking about Judaism 3.0. I would suggest that it's at least Judaism 3.5, if not Judaism 4.0. Now, obviously, you can start splitting hairs and argue that even Judaism 1.0 had many stages. There's Churban Bayit Rishon, and there's Churban Bayit Sheni, and there's Galut Bavel, and there's Shivat Zion. Obviously, you could split this hair in a million different ways. But I think that one of the things that the 3.0 model leaves out is what happens between the demise or the beginning of the demise of Rabbinic Judaism with the Haskalah and the Enlightenment before Zionism takes over. And there is that period. It's relatively short. By the way, it's relatively short because the experiment is destroyed by the Nazis. We don't know to what extent that Haskalah experiment might have survived in Europe had European Jewry not been slaughtered. But nonetheless, there was this period where there were alternatives to Rabbinic Judaism that were not Zionist that were being discussed. There was socialism, there was the Bund, there was communism, there was universalism, there was a cultural kind of a notion, there was nationalism about Jews going somewhere else other than Zion, the territorialism it's commonly called. Those things didn't really amount to very much, perhaps because they were not sufficiently particularistic, like in the case of the Bund, because they were perhaps not very realistic in the case of, let's say, territorialism. Where else were the Jews really going to go? But I do think it's important to note that in the Jews continually reinventing themselves, we don't go directly from Rabbinic Judaism to Zionism. There were a number of other attempts in the middle, some of which we still sort of see a little bit remnants of in different kinds of ways, just to kind of fill out that picture. Now, the question is, I completely agree that we're seeing a revival of religiosity in Zionism. And the question that I want to ask is why? So first of all, I want to suggest that the origins of Zionism were not nearly as secular as people want to imagine. It is true that many of the founding fathers and mothers of Zionism in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, not all of them nearly, by the way, but many of them came from homes that were traditional, and they themselves broke from that religiosity. So they would seem to be really sort of hyper-secularists who not only grew up frum and ended up not become frum and walked out the door, but they walked out the door and slammed the door on their way out. And that's true of many, many people. We know that David Ben-Gurion grew up in a traditional home. Menachem Begin grew up in a traditional home, but didn't leave it behind. Herzl did not grow up in a traditional home. So there's many exceptions, but many of them did. Many of the people that came to Israel and founded the early part of secular Zionism in this country were in fact people who had grown up in the traditional world and not only left it, but as I said, slammed the door. But that slamming of the door was a very strange slamming of the door. Because those people who rejected Jewish tradition completely, at least so it said, knew with absolute certainty that the land of Israel belonged to the Jewish people. And how did they know that? Because the Tanakh said. And if you were to ask them, that's what they would say. And if you look at the very, very first drafts of Israel's Declaration of Independence, which Ben-Gurion in his inimitably sharing style sort of slashed and bashed and did whatever in the last minutes and hours before the declaration, but even long before Ben-Gurion got his hands on it, the first drafts, which were written by Mordechai Beham right around Pesach, 1948, he got the assignment to write the Declaration of Independence on Pesach, 1948. And he went to the home of a guy named Harry Davidovich, and he began to copy long pieces of America's Declaration of Independence. First he wrote Israel's Declaration in English, then he translated it into Hebrew, and it starts out as, whereas God gave the land of Israel to our forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. These are the Tel Aviv secularists, he's a young guy in his 30s at that point, who are writing this. In other words, it was never quite as abjectly devoid of Jewish content as we want to imagine. How do you know that Eretz Israel belongs to Am Yisrael? Look in the Tanakh. And then you would say, yeah, but on the other hand, the Tanakh says a whole lot of other things too. And they would say, yeah, well, whatever. This is the part that we buy. Consistency wasn't necessarily their strong suit. But the first point that I want to make is that Zionism was never as completely secular as we imagine. Those people came from deeply religious roots. And in many respects, by the way, even though they themselves were no longer observant, if they could have been able to foresee where their secularism would lead them, they would have actually backed off much earlier. If Bialik, who tragically did not have children, who died in 34, but if Bialik had had children, and his children had raised their children in secular Palestine, secular Tel Aviv, eventually secular Israel, those grandchildren would not understand their grandfather's poetry. Because you actually need to know Tanakh and Sifrut Chazal in order to understand Bialik's poetry. Say nothing of Agnon. Let's leave that aside. You can't even understand Bialik, even the simple children's song like Nad Ned, Red Ale Ale Vared Mala 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 Mata. The Mishnah says you're not allowed to ask Mala Mala Mata. The Mishnah says specifically, you may not ask Mala Mala, Mala Mata. So what does Bialik do? He writes a little children's song, and they say they're on the seesaw, and what are they singing all day long? Mala Mala, Mala Mata. So it's a shtach, but you only understand the shtach if there's something to shtach. In other words, somebody who doesn't know that Mishnah doesn't get the edginess of Bialik's songs. And you could give lots of examples from the songs, the poems, the stories, and so on and so forth. These people all assumed a certain degree of Jewish literacy, which they were wrong to assume that it would continue. But in that way also, Zionism, even in its secular era, was not nearly as secular as people want to think. The last point that I want to ask is, what's happened that's led to this new push of religiosity making its way back into Zionism? And I want to point to just two quick factors, and then I'll turn it over to Professor Koppel. One of those factors I want to suggest is the 73 war. The 1967 war, of course, created in Israel a tremendous sense of triumphalism. We are completely invulnerable. They're never going to attack us again. Nothing can happen to us. It's either a nes or it's Tzahal, whatever it is. But there is in Israel a great sense of triumphalism. They build the Bar-Lev line, which everybody is told cannot collapse. Of course, it collapses in the first minutes of the war, like a house of cards. But there's a sense between 67 and 73 that Israel's invulnerable. And in fact, when Egypt makes certain overtures through third parties that Nachum Goldman might be sent to go to talk to Sadat, Golda says, why would we possibly talk to Sadat? What's he going to do to us? Well, she found out what he's going to do to us. There was a huge sense of triumphalism, but it only lasted 6 years. And if 6 years after 67 leads you to 73, then what you have to confront is that you're never going to be fully beyond the conflict here. You're never going to be completely safe. So Egypt's resolved. So Jordan's resolved. And Syria doesn't really exist. Lebanon doesn't exist as a country, but it's hardly resolved. But then, of course, other things pop up. If you're always going to have to defend yourself here, if this is never going to become a Hebrew-speaking Riviera, then the question that you have to ask yourself is, why be here? Why stay? Why raise children in a place where they're going to have to fight to stay here also? And I would suggest to you, it's almost impossible to answer that question without resorting to something of Jewish substance. Secularism in and of itself will not provide the answer. Why Zionism? Zionism is a means. It's not an end. It's a means to preserving the Jewish people. Herzl, on the one hand, and Jabotinsky, they were opposites in lots of ways. On the other, socialist, capitalist, different attitudes to tradition, throw in Achad Ha'am, who was even different. But they all had the sense that Tchiyat Am Yisrael Be'eretz Yisrael, the rebirth of the Jewish people in this land, wasn't for the sake of coming to this land. It was for the sake of preserving the Jewish people. Because the Jewish people could not preserve itself in Europe, they said. Little did they know how right they were. But why preserve the Jewish people? You can't say so that there's somebody to live in the Jewish state. That makes no sense. You have to be able to say something about the substance of Jewishness, about the substance of Jewish learning, about the substance of Jewish content in order to be able to justify it. So to go back to Gal's numbers, Zionism 3.0, or Judaism 3.0, which is now Zionism, it's his organizing principle, and I would agree, has a lot of Judaism 1.0. It's very territorially based. It's ironically got its center back in Jerusalem. And it has a lot of Judaism 2.0 because without stuff between what they call the Tanakh to the Palmach in Ben-Gurion's era, without any of that, you can't really talk about the substance of Jewish life. So in a way, the restoration of religiosity back to Zionism is in part caused by a need of the Yom Kippur War to remind people, you need to be able to explain why you're here in Jewish terms. And to do that, you're going to need some of Judaism 1.0. You're going to need a lot of Judaism 2.0. The second thing is, and Gal alluded to this, that it's the rise of the Mizrahi world that has permitted the return of religiosity back into the center of Zionism. I'll say 3 sentences about that and stop. There's a lot of discussion about this return of Mizrahi life. I mean, Begin, of course, was one of the people who permitted it. Begin took great pride in the fact that in the Etzel, for example, in the Irgun, there was no distinction between Ashkenazim and Mizrahim. They fought side by side. They tragically died side by side. And then they suffered being on the periphery of Israeli life for generations side by side as well. And so I think it's important to give credit to Menachem Begin, Zichrono Livracha, especially here in this Mishkan on a night like this. But what many scholars of Mizrahi Judaism have pointed out is that in the Ashkenazi world, the defining characteristic of religiosity is obedience. You know what the halacha says, so you do it. I mean, if you believe that the halacha has authority, then there's not much conversation to be had. You can talk about this posek versus that posek, but there's not a lot of question. It makes absolutely no sense in the Ashkenazi world to go to shul Friday night and drive to the beach Shabbos morning. It makes no sense. If you're a beach goer, don't go to shul. And if you're a shul goer, don't go to the beach. In the Mizrahi world, it makes perfectly good sense to go to the beach, go to the shul Friday night and go to the beach on Shabbos morning, because the operating principles, say many of the scholars of Mizrahi Judaism, is not obedience, but reverence. You can revere the tradition, they say, because you go to shul. You would never not go to shul on Kabbalat Shabbat. Or reverence is not the same thing as obedience. And you think it's mutar to go to the beach in a car? No. Why do you do it? Because that's how I live. And that breaking of the notion of obedience as the defining characteristic has made it possible for Ashkenazim themselves to try on different pieces of Judaism 1.0, Judaism 2.0, Judaism 3.0, without feeling that they have to be chozrim b'tshuva, as you yourself said. You can try this on because it's interesting. You can try it on because it challenges you. You can try it on because it moves you. The minyan that I go to in Baka on Friday nights, not every Friday night, I move around, but one of the minyanim that I go to on Friday night in Baka is filled with people of all different sorts, including people that literally come in black hats and women in all sorts of head coverings. It's an egalitarian minyan after Ma'ariv. Some people don't like that. It's got musical instruments which stop before Mizmor Shir, so that's all right. But a lot of people come and then they leave before Ma'ariv. What are they coming for? Because they like the rabbi who speaks beautifully. They like the music, which sounds beautiful. And I think they like the idea of all of Am Yisrael gathering together on Kabbalat Shabbat to bring in Shabbat together. Women with tattoos on their shoulders and women with big head coverings. Men are coming in shorts and t-shirts, and men are coming literally in long black pants and a long sleeve shirt and a hat. There's a whole way in which we're kind of regrouping here in all different kinds of ways. And that's partly what this Mizrahi ascendancy has allowed. It has allowed us to get out of the notion of kind of a flow chart of obedience and much more into a world of reverence. And I think we're all the richer for it, whether it's our cup of tea or not. I think we're richer for living in a state in which people do not have to make a binary choice between religious and secular. And even that majority that might call themselves not religious can dip their buckets into the well of Judaism 1.0 and Judaism 2.0 and enrich themselves tremendously. So I'll just end by saying that I think that Gal is right. I think that Zionism has become certainly the main organizing principle of Judaism for most of the world, not necessarily for all of it, but for most of it. But I would stress simply that Zionism on its own can't do the job. Zionism can only be meaningful if it's a means to preserving the Jewish people. And the Jewish people's continued existence only means something if the Jewish people has a raison d'etre, if it has something to say, if it has something to believe in, it has something to contribute. And for that, Judaism 3.0 is, for it seems to me, as long as the eye can see, going to be deeply dependent on Judaism 1.0 and Judaism 2.0 as well. And let's conclude by wishing Gal once again Mazal Tov on the appearance of the book.
Okay, that's a lot to respond to. Usually I prefer when I sit there and people get my blood boiling and say all kinds of things that are outrageous, and I come up here full of righteous indignation. You didn't do that. Yeah, sorry, both you guys. I pretty much agreed with everything you said, so that was great. But nevertheless, let me see if I can find some minor points of disagreement, or at least let me try to refine what was said. So when I first heard Gal's thesis before the book was published, it came up, we had a nice talk about the book, and he said, yeah, I think, Judaism used to be that, and now it's something else. Now it's Zionism. And I thought that was a pretty bold statement. I may have used a different adjective than bold. And then, I said, I don't know, to me, isn't an essential part of Zionism, it's initially at least, it's secularism and it's, anti-religiosity. And Gal said to me, yeah, no, I don't mean that. Okay. I said, well, what about, socialism and all that stuff? He said, no, I don't mean that either. He said, and then there's all this statist stuff, the state is doing things the communities used to do. No, I don't mean that either. I said, so maybe you're not actually talking about Zionism. He said, well, I would like to appropriate the term. Well, the Zionism that Gal is talking about, I'm 100% in favor of it. And I even agree with the thesis that, in fact, that is where Judaism is headed. But we need to talk about what Zionism actually is, okay? So let's talk about what Zionism was. So initially, the Zionist revolution, well, the Jews in Galut, in the diaspora, were, let's just say they had very strong civil societies, family, community institutions like Batei Knesset and Batei Midrash. They were very good at that, but they had no political power at all. And what Zionism came to do was essentially to replace that civil society with a state. The idea was, this isn't working, our culture is moribund, our societies are desiccated, none of this is really working for us, okay? And we're vulnerable, which didn't end badly, in fact. So let's replace all this. Let's replace family, community, religion, all the institutions of our communities. Let's replace all that with the state, the all-knowing, all-powerful state. Now, there were several different responses to that. So the majority, the ones who came to, I'm talking about the ones who came to Israel, most of them were in fact secular Zionists who supported that. They said, yes, we are in favor of the state becoming the main expression of Judaism. And then there were the Haredim who said, no, on the contrary, we are rejecting the state because only religion is a true expression of Judaism. And then there were religious Zionists, particularly in the Rav Kook mold, who said, well, no, we are going to reinterpret statism in religious terms. We are going to reinterpret religion in statist terms. A combination of statism and religion, well, it's pretty scary stuff. So those were the ideologies. And then, of course, there were the Mizrahim who did not, they just weren't given expression, okay? Nobody talked about it. They were Masortian, they were traditional, but that wasn't a thing. That wasn't an option. I remember I came on Aliyah in 1980 from the United States, where, well, you could easily move along a continuum between secular and modern Orthodox and Haredi, which at the time didn't actually have a name. You kind of moved along it. You could kind of look Haredi, but at the same time be a professional, a lawyer, a doctor, and so forth. That was completely normal. You could be, all kinds of bizarre combinations of cosmopolitan and bohemian and religious. All this was okay in the States. And then I come to Israel and pick your box, okay? What are you? Are you secular? Are you a religious Zionist in the Kooknik mold? Or are you Haredi? Pick your box. That was it. It didn't, okay? Now, that failed, okay? None of that works anymore. All three ideologies have failed. The secular Zionism has discovered that, well, you know what? They invented rituals, right? I'm sure, right? Shavuot just passed. Everybody gets subjected to some picture from a kibbutz in the 1940s where they're doing some kind of ersatz bikurim ritual, that was the way they were going to celebrate. It's all dead, all right? All this reinvention of Judaism in secular socialist terms turned out to be a dead end, okay? And Haredim suddenly discovered, you know what? The state's actually not so bad, okay? It's not, they used to call it, the Maseh Satan, it came from the devil. Well, there are very few Haredim who are still talking that way these days, right? They want to be part of the state. And religious Zionism, well, they've gone through enough kicks in the teeth that they no longer believe that every bureaucrat of the state, secular or religious, is somehow a messenger from God to bring the redemption, okay? All of these notions are gone. All the ideologies are dead. And where are we headed? Well, it's pretty easy to see that what's happening now is that we're kind of getting this normal distribution, forgive the math talk, right? It's just kind of like a bell curve, right? Where people are finding their spot along this continuum, right? And more importantly, it's not just that the distribution has changed and you don't have to belong to a box. It's that people are actually talking to each other. This is, I think, the most important thing. In my office, there are people who are Haredi or self-identify as Haredi or at least look Haredi, okay? And there are people who look like religious Zionists and there are people who look like secular Zionists, right? But you look at them and you don't actually know what they are, okay? So there's some people in my office who have no outward signs of being religious, but they daven with a minyan 3 times a day and they keep Shabbat, right? And there are others who kind of look religious, they wear a kippah and that, but they're not actually religious. But most importantly, we sit around talking and people are not nice to each other. I mean that in the best possible way, okay? People are not cautious with each other. They're not talking to each other like, I'm afraid that if I say the wrong thing, you're going to accuse me of a microaggression because I kind of stepped on your toes. There's none of that. People talk about the most personal things they talk about religion and they talk about politics, all the things that are supposed to be taboo in polite conversation. And they talk about it completely openly and they never get offended because they genuinely feel like family, okay? The people in my office, okay, it's true that it's not a representative sample because they all share certain political opinions, otherwise they wouldn't be in my office, but set that aside for the moment. I mean, the fact of the matter is that if you look at religious issues, they differ with each other from one extreme to the other, but at the same time, there's really no barriers between them in the sense that they genuinely feel like family and they genuinely speak openly to each other. And what is it that they all seem to agree about? What they all agree about is two things. One is, let's get over this idea of Judaism being represented or expressed only by the state or only by religion or by some bizarre combination of religion and state. They're so past that. The idea, what they agree on is that the state is good at some things, okay? It's good for security. It's good for other things, right? But it's not good at everything, okay? It's not good at deciding how religion, or Judaism specifically, should evolve. That's just not what it's good at. Society, civil society is good at that. Communities are good at that. Families are good at that, okay? The institutions, religious institutions are good at that. But the state isn't good at that. The state shouldn't be dictating how religion should be expressed or shouldn't be expressed. That just the state isn't good at that. And they all agree about that, okay? And they agree in particular that what the state should be doing vis-a-vis religion is exactly one thing. It should be creating a framework in which Jews feel confident, in which Jews feel secure, because when Jews feel confident and secure with each other and vis-a-vis the rest of the world, they're able to evolve their own culture and their own religion in an organic, natural, and comfortable way. So the state is not creating religion, it's not deciding religious questions. What it's doing is creating a framework, an environment that makes people comfortable enough to talk to each other and to allow Judaism to evolve in a very natural way. That's the first thing they agree on. The second thing they agree on, and this is really the theme of the evening, is, let me re-express what you guys said in one sentence, okay? Judaism in the Galut for the past 2,000 years has been a counterculture. And what it's becoming in Israel is the default culture of the country, okay? It's not a counter. When you're a counterculture, you need all kinds of signals in order to keep those barriers around you strong because you're a counterculture, right? There's you and there's the big other that's out there. But when Judaism becomes the default culture of the country, it's going to be expressed in a different way. There's going to be less signaling and there's going to be more substance. Now, in order for Judaism to be the default culture, right, it needs to be scalable. It needs to somehow work, not just for a small community of committed people in a big, vast desert of people who have nothing to do with it or nothing to say about it or nothing to contribute to it, okay? It has to scale up so that it can work for people who are extremely committed, for people who are slightly less committed, for people who are not committed but want to be good Jews in some way. Now, the question is, what does a scalable Judaism look like? The answer is, I don't know, okay? And I hope I live long enough to find out, because that's what's happening in Israel now. It's what's going to be happening in Israel for the next 20, 30, and 50 years. And I can't wait to see how it turns out. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Like this? Can you hear me? So thank you so much for those remarks. I'd like to kick off the conversation by asking, with most of the world becoming more secular, seemingly the opposite of what we're talking about today, what does that mean for Jews who are secular, especially Jews in the diaspora? Does that mean that they're being left out of this conversation? And where do they fit in this in this conversation?
Thanks, Noah. Well, first of all, I'm not sure I buy the premise that the world's becoming increasingly secular. If you were to look at the United States now, it's not exactly a rise of secularism. Well, no, I mean, okay, Europe. The rise of the right in much of Europe is definitely accompanied by a certain religious revival. And I just wouldn't be so, I mean, I think that's a whole other night or conversation. But I'm not so sure that I would buy the premise of the world becoming increasingly secular. But I think the point is very well taken, which is given what Gol describes in his book, which is what we are here to talk about, we all have to sort of come back to the book. Where does that leave secular Jews? Where does that leave secular Jews is your question, and where does it leave secular Jews who may not be Zionists, I think is implicit in your question. I think it's over. I mean, I think that's harsh to say, but I think it's over, and that you will live to see. I mean, unfortunately, and I say that sadly, it's not sustainable. And you can just see it. We won't go through all the data now that you can see, but I mean, the numbers are staggering in America. The numbers of institutions that are closing, the number of institutions that are collapsing. There was an article in the Times of Israel, I think today or yesterday, about Reform and conservative shuls that are closing and becoming Chabad. I mean, some founder of some shul somewhere is spinning in a grave somewhere, but it's a sign of the times. Because at the end of the day, Judaism requires substance for continuity. So if you're not going to be organized by the Judaism 2.0 conversation, and you're not going to be animated by the Judaism 3.0 conversation, they're just being against Israel does make you part of the 3.0 conversation, but it doesn't give you any substance here in your life. Anger at something isn't a means of going through life. So if you're not going to feel part of the grandeur of Judaism 2.0, and you're not going to feel empowered, ennobled, inspired by the extraordinary human revival, which I think is the greatest revival in human history, which is Judaism 3.0, it leaves you actually with nothing. It leaves you with tikkun olam. It leaves you with pablum, universalist meaninglessness. And I don't think anybody in any of those movements chose to lead their flocks there. Nobody did. We should be very careful not to imply that. But they underestimated the power of the stream in which they were swimming. And without enough anchors of Judaism's 2.0 and 3.0, the stream is simply carrying people down the river. And the answer to Noah's question is, I think it leaves you in very short amount of time, a footnote to the story that Jewish history is going to tell.
I completely agree with that. So I will be very brief. I'll just put it in context. I said moments ago that what's happening in Israel is that instead of boxes, we're getting some kind of a continuum. And I think that that's a very healthy development. What I didn't say is that what's going on outside of Israel is the exact opposite, which is that if you can't meet a certain bar of separatism, of parochialism, of religiosity, you're gone, you're toast, okay? So what's really happening is that we're getting a split. What we're seeing is some small fraction of Jews are building higher and higher walls around them, and all the rest of them are just being left out of those walls.
Yeah, I agree. And Moshe said that we're allowed to speak directly and bluntly. As I would say a bit more directly, I think American Jewry is evaporating. The Jews have always been a nation religion, and there's been two attempts that have failed. One is the attempt we spoke about, all of us, the attempt to de-religiousize Israel, to de-religiousize Judaism, and that has failed because we are seeing, as we spoke about, Israelis, Mizrahi, and Ashkenazis having a rapprochement with religion while staying secular. There was an attempt in America to denationalize the Jewish nation religion, to reduce Judaism to the Jewish church. That has failed. That is absolutely failed. I don't think there's other ways of saying that. There are Orthodox Jews in America, and there are a very small part of conservative and Reform Jews that go to synagogue, every week or so. But this is a small minority of the Jews. The core of American Jewry, is basically becoming Americans of Jewish ancestry, and it's very common for other parts of Americans. Irish Americans, I have an Irish American friend who said, no, I'm still very Irish. Like, why are you very Irish? Because I go to St. Patrick's Day parties. Well, so do I, and I drink Guinness, and so do I. And sure enough, when I try to do a Rosh Hashanah dinner at my place in New York, the people who are interested are non-Jews who wanted to have a Jewish experience. So the one thing that does bring, that is relevant to American Jews, where 80% of diaspora Judaism is centered, and that's why I think we're focused about that, is Israel, and is the national aspect of Judaism, which is Zionism. And Israel is really its geographical manifestation. And that's what evokes not just passion and emotions in the positive or in the negative, but that's how people look at you. And that's so the fact that Zionism is becoming more religion helps this, because it's not an anti-religious concept. It doesn't, in a sense, I agree with what you said, Daniel, that America is a religious country, really. America is becoming more religion, both because of immigration patterns of, people, Latin Americans and others who are religious who are coming to America, and because of internal American. But the American Jews are perceived as flag carriers of secularism, rightly or wrongly. So actually, by aligning their Jewish identity through Zionism, they are now more in line with the predominant American narrative, if there is such a thing, that is more religious. So I think that Zionism, the Jewish or religious revival in Zionism actually helps the American Jew cling to an aspect of Judaism that is relevant to him in positive or in negative, which is Zionism.
You can take a question from the audience if there's something that anybody wants to ask anything. You, the gentleman in the black shirt.
David Kra from the neighborhood. So of all the sessions I've been here, this is really the least confrontational. This is the most kumbaya agreement that I've ever seen here. Menachem Begin would vomit. So I want to combine two things. About 20 years ago, I was here on business, and my handler here for my company said, there is no place in Israel for you, because I was wearing a solid black crocheted kippah. It didn't fit in the political spectrum. He said he never, he was born in Jerusalem, he never came here anymore because Jerusalem was poor, religious, dirty, and depressing. So I want to say, Baruch Hashem, it has changed. And really, so it's not a question for you, but I agree with you that this is a novel experience. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Does anyone want to ask a question? And if you want to make it a little bit more controversial, so we can fight up here, then we're happy to do that too. The gentleman straight ahead. You're going to get a microphone.
Microphone. We've kind of glossed over the Haredi world. Predictions are that in not very long, they're going to be a majority of Jews here in Israel. They are by far a strong portion of the remaining Jewry in North America. 40 years from now, what's going to be? It'll be one very large Lakewood, or some portion. So that's one. Number two, Daniel, where is the shul you're talking about? I'd love to go there Friday night. Bemet, I mean, okay, I'm looking for
the shul's at Beit Sefer Geulim in Baka. That's where it is. It's in Beit Sefer Geulim. I don't know what street it's on. Ben Yefuneh, I think, actually. But Ben Yefuneh. It's Tzion Kihila Artzi Israelit. So you can find it online. Just Google. I once said that to a person not that long ago, a person who was a little bit getting on in years. I said to her, when you get home, you can Google it. And she goes, yeah, my computer has Google. So I hope yours does too. And you can just Google it, Kihilat Tzionot Israelit. So first of all, I want to say to the gentleman who asked the non-question, I don't think Begin would vomit. No, I actually mean that really quite seriously. I think that he got used to working in a country in which there was tremendous vitriol. Not all three of us, by the way, said the same thing. There are differences between what we said, and there are chilukei deyot that are some are more subtle and more substantive, but I think part of what is really wonderful about Gol's book is that it enables you to have these conversations in which you really disagree around a provocative thesis, which enables the conversation to actually sound much more amiable than most of the conversation is in which we normally conduct ourselves. And I actually think that's a wonderful thing. I actually think that it's wonderful not to leave an event in Jerusalem at night thinking you're going to have a stroke. So I actually don't think that Begin would vomit. I don't think we all agree about everything. I don't think that Kumbaya is necessarily a fair characterization of what's happening here. Other than that, I completely agree with you. Now, so how's that for a little bit machloket? The Haredi thing is worrying. Look, let's be worried. But the Haredi, if you want to talk about the Haredi issue is really worrisome, mostly on the economic level. The Haredi, they're not part of the tax base. That's a whole other conversation. In other words, Gal's not talking about tax-based issues in his book. The Haredim, in terms of what Gal's talking about, I don't think we glossed over because I don't think they're that different. And I think Moshe pointed to this in the very Kumbaya office in which he works, as long as you're a right-wing Zionist, free capitalist, a free market capitalist, right? Fair enough? There you go. No, but the Haredim, so the economic issue of the Haredim is a huge issue, which it's beyond the pale of our conversation tonight. But again, the Haredim are not nearly as anti-Zionist as people think they are. There used to be a day when the Haredim would not take any ministries to show how anti the government they were. Then they started to take deputy ministries. Then they started to take deputy ministries when there was no minister. Then you get to people like Litzman, who was more than happy to be Sar HaBriut, especially in a very contentious time, leaving out all the peculiarities of his particular kahuna. In other words, the idea that Haredim won't be ministers in the Israeli government is like a quaint memory of a past long since gone. There's the Haredim Chadashim, who are a very important movement inside the Haredi world, who are opening things up. If you look at certain parts of the Haredi world, women are becoming increasingly educated, as in every society. As women become educated, birth rates go down. It's true, by the way, in the Arab population in Israel. It's true in the Palestinian population in the West Bank. I mean, it's true everywhere you look, in Israel, around the world, and so forth. So the Haredim are not as different on the Zionist front as many people want to assume they are. We don't need their manpower for the army. Everybody knows that the army is becoming less human power centric, and they're cutting down service for men and for women, and it's all becoming remote, etc. So I think that we didn't talk about Haredim tonight because tonight they're not an issue. If we were going to have a conversation about the economic stability of Israel 50 years from now, they'd be a major issue. But that's a different subject from the one that Gal wrote about.
Yeah, on the Haredi part, I agree. I'm not going to repeat, but there's a chapter in the book that talks exactly about that. I actually think that Haredis, in many respects, are poster child of Zionism. If you're on an El Al flight flying from New York to Israel or anywhere to Israel, you see a lot of Haredi people. The more Haredi visit Israel than non-Haredis. The Jewish nation is central in their theme. I agree with a lot of what Daniel said. I claim that the mainstream in Israeli secularism is dati lefamim, sometimes religious, meaning people that consume religiosity a la carte. When I consume religiosity, I don't go to Daniel's synagogue, which one might expect, but I go to Haredi synagogues, and I'm very well welcomed there. And to me, I go to a place called to Zichron Moshe, which is a shtiblach of basically a mall of 8 or 9 overlapping Haredi minions. There's hundreds, maybe over 1,000 people there on Shabbat morning. And to me, that is when they yell at the beginning of every month, Kol Yisrael Chaverim, that is a very powerful demonstration of Zionism and the triumph of Zionism. We can talk about that in another time about the nuances about Haredis. But about the Kumbaya comment, look, I mean, this is maybe this 8th or 9th event we're doing around the book. I've been introduced in a few of them by people associated with American progressive politics. We had progressives, leftists, Meretz to far right, and we had might even have Meretz to far right here on the stage. And in American politics, progressives to Trump supporters. I'm not saying that everybody agrees with the book, but there is a question of where are we in Judaism, and I'm claiming that Zionism is its organizing principle, and people come with their own views and can debate the nuances, but it's not a political book. So I agree that being in relative, focusing on the nuances and advancing the discussions this way is more conducive than having people that are going to fight, having a good fight gladiator style on the stage. Yes, absolutely. And the first 2/3 of the book is trying to prove the thesis that Zionism is the organizing principle of Judaism. And I do that by doing an analysis of Jewish communities, of the trends in America, where the American Jews live, trends, global trends, how people relate to the Jews. But the bottom third is the so what? And that is exactly relating to your question. Herzl identified at his time that the opposition to Judaism is chronic. And it was European opposition because the Jews lived in Europe, and that's where the opposition to Judaism evolved. Many people at his time, at the end of the 19th century, said, it's gone. There's no more anti-Jewish, there's no more, because opposition to Judaism until then was expressed through religious vehicles. The Jews used the blood of Christians to make matzahs. That was a known fact for many people in the Middle Ages and even in the 19th century and later. Once Europe became secular, one of Herzl's predecessors, Moshe Haas, said, well, so end of history, kumbaya between Jews and non-Jews. Nobody expected the rise of a new form of Jew hatred, which we now call anti-Semitism, which a term that was only coined at the end of the 19th century, to say that the hatred is now directed to the national aspect. So we can tell, if the question is where is the state of Judaism, then you can tell one good indication is where is the opposition to Judaism is directed to. And it is directed through Zionism, clearly. That is the one aspect, there's not a lot of opposition to Judaism in terms of theological and otherwise. You don't hear about that. But you do hear a lot of opposition to Judaism through Zionism. This is, of course, not to say that criticism, that every criticism is illegitimate opposition. But I think we have an asset in this round of defending against opposition to Judaism, which is what you alluded about anti-Zionism and anti-Judaism. In the past, it was very fashionable to say, I hate Jews. There's no problem with that. It was a fashionable thing to say, I'm against Jews. I'm an anti-Semite. So Herzl had anti-Semitic friends who said, I'm an anti-Semitic, and these were still his friends. Just like today, I have friends who are Israel bashers, Jews and non-Jews, who are anti-Zionists, and they're still my friends. Today, though, it is not popular and a taboo to say you're an anti-Semite, that you hate Jews, but it is very popular and even a rite of passage in certain circles to say that you're anti-Zionist and that you love the Jews, but you hate the Zionists. Once you accept the thesis in the book that we discussed, that Zionism is the anchor of Judaism, that Judaism is transforming and Zionism is its organizing principle, then you cannot hide between this false facade that you love the Jews and you hate the Zionists. Just like 2,000 years ago, you couldn't hide by saying, I love the Jews, those who worship in temple and those who live in Zion and Judea, but they haven't lived there in 100 years. But I hate the Jews who wear a kippah and go to synagogue. I hate the rabbinic Jews. You couldn't do that because there was a recognition that Judaism was transformed and rabbinic Judaism is now the organizing principle of Judaism. I'm saying the same thing. Once we recognize that Zionism is the organizing principle of Judaism, then we go a long way at mitigating our generation's existential threat to Judaism, which is Israel bashing.
Yeah, I don't know if anti-Zionism is or is not identical to anti-Semitism, but it doesn't matter because I find them both repulsive. I just want to comment, by the way, to the gentleman who made the comment about the black kippah sruga that he was the only one wearing back then. It's a curious fact that the two people who are up on this panel wearing kippot are both wearing black kippot srugot. And I'm betting that when Gal goes to his Haredi shul, he does too. Is that true?
I wear my, I don't know, every time I wear the kippah.
Okay,
But
there you
it's
go.
clearly that I'm not correct. I'm not trying to.
I
He
think you'd have a
matches his
hard
outfit.
you'd have a hard time pulling that off. Yeah, but yeah, whatever.
A question from Paul, who will represent someone who is asking from Zoom.
Yeah, we want to give the Zoom audience their say as well. So we had a question here. This is actually throwing a bit of a bone of contention into proceedings, perhaps. So I think this gentleman is in the United States. He doesn't say, but he says that you are glossing over the real fractured relationships which prevail in Israel today, and that Jerusalem is he says, made as unwelcoming as possible for those who do not share the narrow-minded attitudes of Haredim. And I think he's, I think reading between the lines, I think he's talking about Reform and conservative Jews from the United States coming to Jerusalem and feeling unwelcome in Jerusalem. And maybe, if I can, I hope you don't mind, I hope this gentleman doesn't mind if I add to this, maybe we can talk about one of the things that hasn't been mentioned, which is the issues like the Kotel and the ways in which Reform and conservative Jews maybe feel unwelcome in Israel. And I know we have a lot of American audience members on Zoom, so maybe we could.
Yeah, so how's that relevant? Just I want to understand. It's a sheila, not a kushia. How is that relevant to the conversation we're having tonight?
I guess because they're also Jews, and they may well care about Israel, but they don't accept. Or he is saying they don't accept the portrayal of Jerusalem.
How can they be part of the narrative of Zionism 3.0 if they're not being included in part of the conversation on the government? And
I got it. Okay, so I'll just answer very quickly, and then my colleagues can add. So first, I'll say something about the Israeli youth with whom I work at Shalem College, who range from completely secular to very, very, very deeply rooted in the religious community. The majority of them do not get married by the Rabbanut anymore. The overwhelming majority of them do not get married by the Rabbanut. Some of them get married by Tzohar rabbis. Some of them use an organization called Chupot. Many of them get married by each other in their class. Somebody's a Mesader Kiddushin or the Mesaderet Kiddushin. Most of them are now not registering their marriages with Misrad HaPnim and Misrad HaDatot. In other words, the rebellion against the rabbinate is not an American reformer conservative phenomenon. The rebellion against the rabbinate is a widespread phenomenon. And the reason they're doing it is not because they're reformer conservatives, because they don't like a lot of things about the rabbinate, which we won't go into tonight, but I think they're pretty patently obvious to most of the people in the audience, both present and remote. So the sense of resistance to that is not only an American issue. Point number one. Point number two is this. Look, there's a tricky thing about democracies, which is that the people who vote determine what they do, and the people who don't vote don't determine what they do. So I'll give you an example having nothing to do with Reform and conservative. The rise of the Mizrahim, which we've talked about tonight, is a huge civil rights success in Israel. I mean, just think about it. They were on the periphery economically, culturally, religiously, in every possible way. I mean, Ben-Gurion sent them out to the periphery. Ben-Gurion needed people to populate yeshuvim along the borders, so he sent them there. I mean, that's what he did with the immigrants that came from all over the place. The Ma'abarot, which were everything from Sderot was a Ma'abarat, Talpiot was a Ma'abarat, believe it or not. The Ma'abarot were pools of mud in the winter and baking ovens in the summer, and Ashkenazim did not get sent to them. Now, what's happened to the Mizrahim, and now you look at who's in music, who's in politics, who's on the courts, who's teaching at the universities. It is an enormous civil rights success. It's a civil rights success, by the way, of the sort that America, United States, has not actually been able to reproduce. Here's the rub about that civil rights success. Those people actually do not want an egalitarianized form of Judaism. It's not what they're about. The women are doctors and lawyers and judges and economists and mathematicians, but they're very comfortable with a traditional role for women in shuls. They're teaching, they're giving Gemara shiurim, but they're not looking to lead tefillah. Now you can agree, you can disagree, you can like it, you can not like it. But the notion that we want to take pride in Israel's civil rights accomplishments as long as Israel's ruling parties then mimic our own religious worldview, that's not how democracy works. In other words, if Mizrahim are going to rise to the top of Israel, which they are, and if Mizrahis are already the majority of Israeli Jews, which they already are, then the success of their democratic rise means that they have a right to what they believe in. They are not looking to expand all sorts of things outside the realm of orthodoxy. I don't personally agree. I think there should be an egalitarian space at the Kotel. I don't think it comes at the expense of anybody else. If a group of people over at Robinson's Arch want to daven and if that place had a better entrance and it had better security and had better bathrooms, I don't think it comes at anybody's space. But here's the thing. There's not a single Israeli among the almost 10 million Israelis here. There's not a single Israeli for whom that is the number one electoral issue, or the number two electoral issue, or the number three electoral issue, or the number four electoral issue. None, not a single one of the 10 million Israelis almost who live here thinks that is number 1, 2, 3, or 4 in terms of how they're going to vote. And therefore that issue, as much as it pains me, I think we're being gratuitously nasty and gratuitously short-sighted. That's how a democracy works. And I'll say this now as somebody who's got many friends in the Reform movement, many friends in the conservative movement, et cetera, et cetera. If that's going to be the barrier to loving Israel, then the love isn't genuine. There's a lot of things that I love about there's a lot of things that I don't love about my kids. I love them, but there's a lot of things about their decisions that I don't personally agree with. And they're not small things. It's not like what kind of an omelet they make in the morning. But if that's going to get in the way of my loving them, then I didn't really love them at the beginning. It's okay to love someone and be frustrated by certain things about them. It's okay to love the state of Israel and say, but I wish the attitude to Reform and conservative Jews was different. I live here and I wish the attitude to Reform and conservative Jews was different. And I'm not a part of a Reform or conservative synagogue. But it's important to me. I think we should do it. But when that becomes the reason that I can't embrace this, then the nature of the love at the very beginning was so thin, seems to me, as to not be worth very much. Now we got some disagreement.
What he said.
I'll say what Daniel said in a little bit different. The synagogue that Israeli seculars choose not to go to is clearly an Orthodox synagogue. There is a lot of Israelis that have, that don't engage in any type of religion, but when they do, they want the rabbi to have, metaphorically a beard and a hat. And, the question is, how can you identify with Zionism? How can Zionism be the essence of your Judaism, where you have issues of the Kotel? It's not only, as I agree, that this is this is much more encompassing, but also there is an acceptance that this is, when you go to France, it'll be nice if there'll be more street signs in English and more people that will speak English. But there's, I think, an acceptance that this is the way it is in France, that people are not particularly maybe English speaking or the street signs in English. I think that we need to make a distinction, and I discussed this in the book. I actually addressed the issue of the Kotel in the book. We need to make a distinction between when it comes to American reforms, between the leaders, the American reform leadership, some of which are, many of them I'm friends with, and the American reform masses, which most of my American friends are either reform or conservative, and most of them don't even know if they're reform or conservative. They're under-engaged Jews that belong to a synagogue, that when they have life-changing events or in Yom Kippur, if they can, they go. These are two separate audiences. Now, it's true that, at least for many of my friends, when they come to the Kotel and they're told and they know that they need to separate from their wives or husbands, and there's a gender separation, that they're upset about that. But they're not upset about it anywhere close to the level that this is being portrayed, at least the people I speak to. If you ask them, what are you more upset about? The fact that the Kotel that you couldn't pray alongside your wife in the Kotel, or that there's not a great wine bar in the shuk? There's great places for beer, there's great restaurants, but they'll probably say the wine bar or another luxury restaurant in Jerusalem. Meaning, I'm not, God forbid, underestimating how important this issue is for people. But I'm saying that for the majority, the mass majority of Jews that are reform and conservative or under-engaged Jews, that doesn't rise to that level that it makes Zionism an unacceptable or a problem thing. For certain people, it does. for certain people who are, part of the leadership, it does. But these are a minority, a small minority within the overall reform and conservative movement.
I think we'll take one more question from the audience.
Wait, can I make a suggestion? Since there's so many hands, do you want to take a few questions and we'll just do a round? Should we ask a few people, and then we'll just answer them combinedly? You also have a question. So we'll take all of Betty's questions and then your question.
So the woman right over there and
Why don't we talk to
yeah, so the woman right over there.
Thank you. This was awesome, but I want to point out, I mean, I think we can agree that not all Jews are Zionists, but not all Zionists are Jewish. And Zionism is not necessarily exclusive to Judaism. You see in the world, not just supporters of Israel, but like even biblically, like, Christian Zionists who are supporting. So I guess I just want to know like how this can be the anchor of Judaism when it's actually biblical and there are other people who also believe the Bible.
Thank you. This is a very important distinction. So first of all, so not all Jews are Zionists. That is correct, but they're defined. I'm arguing that they're defined by their Zionism more and more. That has become the most relevant aspect of their Judaism, or to me, more precise, the least irrelevant aspect of their Judaism, because the vast majority of Jews outside of Israel, especially American Jews, are under-engaged Jews. Jews is very low on their hierarchy of identity. So, and we've seen it even in synagogues, like we had a few that get together and pass a resolution that they're anti-Zionists. So a synagogue that gets together and have meetings and debates and resolutions and pass that resolution, and they're anti-Zionism, for them too, Zionism is what connected them to their Judaism, because they don't go to synagogue to pray. They don't go to make matzah balls, and they don't go to talk about the Holocaust, and they don't go for any other reasons other than to meet and talk about Zionism, in this case, to pass the resolution. So you are defined by your Zionism, by yourself and by the outside. And we had the same thing probably thousands of years ago when a lot of Jews says, I'm anti-rabbinic Judaism, and some of them are still with us today, the Karaites, the ones who said, I'm staying in Judaism 1.0 and I will not transform to Judaism 2.0. But today the term Judaism and rabbinic Judaism is intertwined, and I think the term Judaism and Zionism will be intertwined in a few decades even. On your second question, it's a very important distinction to make. I'm saying that Judaism, I think we're all saying, is a nation religion, and the rabbinic Judaism is the contemporary and for a long time been the religious expression of the Jewish nation religion, and Zionism is the national expression of the Jewish nation religion. There are a lot of friends of Zion in the Christian world. There's a lot of friends of Zion in the Middle East, in the Arab world, in the Muslim world. And being, I can be a friend of your family, but maybe luckily I'm not part of your family because you seem to be very critical of your family. So I can be a part of your family. I can, even be, a fan, but it doesn't mean that I'm part of the nation. So I think just like we spoke earlier to that gentleman's question, that the opposition to Judaism is funneled today through Zionism. I think the love to Judaism that we're seeing in those circles is funneled today through Zionism as well.
I'm just going to respond to that also. I think it's an excellent question. It's really provocative, and it's kind of too bad that it didn't come up an hour ago. We could talk about it. But I want to push back just a tiny bit. I know that everybody uses the word Christian Zionists. I'm not sure it's the same Zionism. And I'll give you an analogy. The home that I grew up in America was a very civil rights oriented home. So my parents were deeply committed to the civil rights movement, and I went on marches with my parents and yada, yada, yada. But we didn't have the same skin in the game as African Americans who wanted civil rights. We cared about it. We thought it was the right thing. We did a little bit about it, but it wasn't fundamentally going to change our lives and the lives of our children. Zionism is very simply the national liberation movement of the Jewish people. That's what it is. It is not the belief that the Jews should have a state. They're very close, but they're not the same. Zionism, I think, is the national liberation movement of the Jewish people. So you can be a fan of that movement if you're not a Jew. And thank God there are millions of such people. But I think when we call them Christian Zionists, and I have lots of Christian friends who call themselves Zionists. I mean, they would be not happy with what I'm saying, and some of them probably watching, and then I'll hear from them, but that's okay. I think it's a different kind of Zionism. And the analogy that I would use is that civil rights thing. Yes, they care about us, but they don't have the same skin in the game that Jews have, because this is our national liberation movement. And I feel terribly grateful that they support it. I feel terribly grateful that maybe their theology endorses it. But their Zionism and my Zionism are completely different, because my Zionism is about a movement that enables me to live the life that I want to live as a human being. And their Zionism is not about the kind of lives that they or their children are going to be able to live.
My last question is, I know Daniel mentioned that he believes that the title probably should have been Judaism 4.527 or whatever. But my question is, what is the next iteration of Judaism, let's say 5.0 to be generous?
Yeah, my view is, and I hinted to it at the end of my words, Jewish history evolves, Jewish culture evolves, and the whole point of evolving processes are you can't skip, okay? There's a certain sequence of things, and you can't even predict them, okay? The point is they need to play themselves out, and we're going to try different things, okay? The different communities are going to try different things. Some are going to be more open and more cosmopolitan. Some are going to be more parochial and more self-contained, and some of them are going to survive, and some of them are not going to survive. And maybe a bunch of them will survive, and they'll blend in various interesting ways. But the point is, you can't skip steps, and you can't look ahead.
So I completely agree with that. But I don't know if it's mutar to say this at the Begin Center, but there was an article in Haaretz yesterday, I think it was in the English, I don't remember anymore, but I was definitely in the English. And it's written by two rabbis in America whose names I apologize that I don't recall. And it says, American Judaism is in decline, and that's a great thing. And the reason two rabbis would write this is because they were arguing that certain institutions collapse and other things come in their place. And this is a movement of transition and transformation. And you can't argue with that part of the premise. But here's what I would say about Zionism 5.0 or Judaism 5.0 that we know nothing about. And I agree with Moshe, you just have to sort of play it out and you can't predict it. It's going to have substance. And it's going to have to be a continuation of the conversation that is in the Tanakh, and that is in the Mishnah, and in the Gemara, and in Shlomo ibn Gvirol, and Yehuda Halevi, and then in Achad Ha'am, and then in David Grossman, and so on and so forth. If it's not a continuation of that conversation, if it's not literate in that conversation, it'll be something 5.0, but it won't be Judaism 5.0. Whatever Judaism is going to be, it's got to be based in, rooted in, deeply immersed in those former versions of Judaism that were deeply rich, that were deeply textual, that were deeply contemplative. And if it moves on from there, it'll be something probably worth taking seriously.
So the gentleman that asked about disagreement is finally going to get to it. I disagree with all three of you. I disagree with the premise of the question. It's a great question, but we are in the very, very early stages of Judaism 3.0. We're in the very early stages of Zionism. It is like asking in the 2nd century, what's going to come after Rabbinic Judaism, which something came, which I argue is Zionism 2,000 years later. It's like asking a baby, it's like 3 days old. Well, let's make some funeral arrangements when you're 120 years old, except that here, we don't know how long Judaism 3.0 lasts. Maybe, 1,000 years, maybe 2,000 years, like Judaism 2.0, maybe longer. As of now, we are in the beginning of a process that not just, as I mentioned, Jews came back to Zion, but Judaism came back to Zion. Demographically, it's projected that 2/3 of the Jews will live in Israel in the next, I think, 30 or 40 years. And the narrative is in Zionism. This is what I'm arguing, and I think we agree, is now becoming the focal point of Judaism. And I think it's the beginning of that. It's going to be here for a long time. Now, if I can redo the question a little bit, what is within Judaism 3.0? What is Zionism? Should there be the Haredis and tax bases, and should there be buses on Shabbat and the Kotel? All of those are questions I'm not even touching in the book, and that's probably why I have the sort of like people from the left and from the right that are supporting it, because this is, first, let's agree, as I think we do, that Zionism is now the organizing principle of Judaism. Then there's a lot of discussion, what is Judaism? And you pointed correctly that there's a think tank called Zionism 3.0 that discusses those issues, I believe. So which are two separate things. I'm saying Zionism is the anchor of Judaism. We can debate later what's within Zionism. Now, at the conclusion of the book, not to be spoiler alert, I do say that while Herzl defined Zionism as an infinite ideal, it is possible that in the future there will be some sort of, Zionism will transform out, just like just Judaism 2.0 went to 3.0 up to 2,000 years. And there will be some sort of Judaism 4.0, but we don't even know what it is. We cannot even begin to think about what it is. I think what we need to do is understand that we are in a very historic moment of Judaism, of the Jewish story. The Jews have come back to Zion, Judaism have come back to Zionism, and Zionism is becoming the ideal, the infinite ideal that, as Herzl envisioned, not just unite the Jews together, but serves as the beacon to humanity. Humanity is advanced through Zionism. Zionism is light to the nations.
I don't think we're going to have enough time for more questions, but thank you everyone for coming. And I wanted to thank you, the panelists, for an enlightening and thoughtful discussion that may or may not have made Megan vomit. We don't know. He's not alive for us to know. So I also wanted to again plug Paul's book and the website, which is Judaism-Zionism.com. Please visit that for any other further events. Thank you.
And I would also like to thank all our participants and also Noah for moderating so wonderfully. And thank you all for coming, and please do come again and join my mailing list. Email me, paulg@begincenter.org.il, and you'll hear about other English events that we have here at the center. Thank you very much. Good night.
We're just going to be in the 30s. Well,